On the evening of July 3rd, 1954, in San Antonio, Texas, J.C. Horton went out for drinks with his wife Helen. They took their two young children to the Lazy A Tavern on Loop 13. Their son Jesse was 5 years old. Their daughter, Chere Jo, was just 3. According to J.C., the children got into a fuss just after 11 p.m. and left the bar. 5 minutes later, Helen went outside to see if the children were all right and noticed Chere Jo was missing. After calling her name and scouring the parking lot to no avail, they called police. A search party was quickly formed, and in less than an hour, a group of nearly 200 people were searching for the missing girl. Half of them were military members stationed at Lackland Air Force Base. Police Staff Sergeant Harry Brown found Chere Jo's lifeless body in the gravel pit. Her neck was broken, and her body looked like it had been attacked by an animal. County Highway Patrolman Eugene Talbert found a car parked a few hundred yards from a gravel pit off Frio City Road near the tavern. Hanging from one of the car doors was a pair of child's underwear. A shirtless man, bloody and covered in scratches, emerged from the bushes on a bluff overlooking the pit, and Patrolman Talbert drew his weapon, trained it on him, placed him under arrest, and put him in his car. He was calm but appeared to be in a dazed condition and made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. The owner of the Lazy A Tavern, Fred Adams, was part of the search party and thought he recognized the man in custody. He confirmed with one of the tavern's waitresses who was helping with the search, 33-year-old Della Sanchez, that the man was one of 2 airmen she was serving that evening and added, "He's the one who did it." The man was 29-year-old Jimmy Nebron Shaver, a decommissioned airman 3rd class and a drill instructor at Lackland Air Force Base. He was recently married to his 3rd wife, Grace, and had 2 children. Before Talbert was able to take the man to the county jail, Constable Ed Schaefer claimed he wanted to take the man to be questioned by the area provost marshal, Colonel Albert Feldman. Hours later, he was taken to San Antonio Police Headquarters for further investigation. He agreed to take a lie detector test, which he passed, but eventually admitted to abducting and murdering 3-year-old Chere Jo, and he locked in his story by signing a written statement. The statement clarified that he left the bar with his friend and fellow airman Sumter Coe Bawley and drove him back to Lackland Air Force Base before driving back to the Lazy A Tavern, where he saw the little girl outside. He said she started talking to him and followed him to his car. He put her in the car and drove away. He remembered hitting her in the face when she started crying and taking her out of the car and through a fence in some brush near the gravel pit. He claimed he couldn't remember anything after that, but reasoned that since the assault took place and he was the only one there, he must have done it, and wrote, "I assume all responsibility for what has happened." Bexar County Police Investigator Dean Jones said he blamed it on drinking. Murder charges were filed against Shaver that afternoon, and he was held at Bexar County Jail without bond. On July 12th, a Bexar County grand jury indicted Shaver on counts of and murder with malice. It took them only an hour and 45 minutes to deliberate and return the indictment. Special Court Judge Joe Brown instructed the new grand jury to make the case its first order of business and slated the trial to begin on August 16th. District Attorney Austin F. Anderson announced that he would seek the death penalty if and when the cases were tried. Shaver was brought into the courtroom at 2:20 p.m. to meet with his court-appointed lawyer. Judge Brown appointed well-known San Antonio lawyer Ronald Smallwood to represent him. Shaver had just returned to the courthouse after spending 30 minutes revisiting the crime scene with sheriff's investigators and district attorney investigator Joe Hesler. He looked dazed as he sat in the courtroom, unaware of everyone around him, including his wife, who he made no attempt to acknowledge. Chief Investigator Oscar Warnke planned on taking Shaver back to the scene, but that was called off after his attorney instructed him not to speak to anyone but him moving forward. Warnke wouldn't elaborate on the details of the visit, but did say it was helpful and that Shaver broke down and cried. On July 28th, Judge Joe Brown ordered the trial be moved to Brady in McCulloch County, stating that there had been too much publicity surrounding the case in Bexar County to secure an impartial jury. On August 3rd, the state requested that Shaver be examined by County Health Officer G.D. Boyd to determine whether he was sane. Shaver's new court-appointed defense attorney, M.C. Gonzalez, also asked for Shaver to be examined. He requested a psychiatric examination at Santa Rosa Hospital to determine whether he suffered permanent brain damage during his 3-year career as a professional boxer. Both examinations were granted. On Saturday, August 14th, Anderson announced that the trial was being delayed because they couldn't find a judge to preside over the case after Judge A.O. Newman fell ill. The same day, Shaver's attorney requested that Shaver be taken from the Bexar County Jail to Lackland Air Force Base to undergo another psychiatric evaluation. Bexar County Sheriff Owen W. Kilday refused to transfer him for the exam, and on Friday, August 27th, Gonzalez told the court that if his motion to have him examined at Lackland were denied, he would likely withdraw as Shaver's attorney, adding that Lackland has the nation's best psychiatrists, and they'd agreed to examine Shaver. The hearing was held on September 1st, the following Wednesday, and Judge Joe L. Mays granted the defense motion and ordered Shaver be taken to San Antonio for examination by Lackland psychiatrists, but was to remain in the custody of the Bexar County Sheriff's Office to ease their fears that Air Force officials may claim jurisdiction over him. Jury selection was held on Monday, September 20th, and the defense was granted a court order for a special sanity hearing. The hearing was held over the next 2 days, and the jury ruled that Shaver was fit to stand trial. They determined he was sane during the crime, and he was sane as he sat in the courtroom. The Air Force psychiatrist that examined Shaver at Lackland Base testified that he was insane at the time of the crime and that voices told him to kill Chere Jo, but that he was sane now. State psychiatrists disagreed he was insane at the time of the murder and claimed that the men were simply trying to save face and were eager to prove their theory. Bexar County Health Officer G.D. Boyd testified that he examined Shaver for 2 hours, and he never made any mention of hearing voices. Testimony in the trial started on Wednesday, September 29th, and the prosecution rested after presenting Shaver's signed statement to the court. Part of the statement read, "If she was and if she is dead, then I must be responsible, since I was the one who picked her up and put her in my car." When the defense case began, Bexar County Health Officer G.D. Boyd was asked if Shaver had been beaten by officers prior to providing the statement, and he testified that he examined Shaver that day and found no signs of abuse. Defense attorney Sam McCollum asked Dr. J.A. Griswold, a resident doctor at Robert B. Greene Hospital, if he was positive the man he examined was Jimmy Shaver, and bizarrely, he answered no. After the Lackland psychiatrist took the stand and told the jury that Shaver was insane at the time of the murder, the defense rested. The trial ended after final arguments on Friday, October 1st, and the jury began deliberations at 6 p.m. On Saturday, October 2nd, the jury reached its verdict, and Jimmy Shaver was sentenced to death. His attorneys announced their intention to appeal the verdict, and on Saturday, October 30th, the motion was heard by Judge Joe L. Mays. MC Gonzalez argued that a mistrial must be granted because a juror allegedly stated that he would vote to convict Shaver and send him to the electric chair if he was given the opportunity. Judge Mays overruled the defense motion, and the case was sent to the Court of Criminal Appeals on June 15, 1955. On June 22nd, Shaver was granted a new trial based on the testimony of Ramey Dykes, who said juror Troy Cates told him, "If I am selected on that jury, I will burn the bum or hang the jury until doomsday." Cates was the brother-in-law of the sheriff of McCulloch County and served as a deputy chief under him for 2.5 years. Shaver's retrial began on March 26, 1956, in Bell County, Texas, and the result was the same. The jury began deliberations on March 31st, and it took them less than an hour to return with a guilty verdict, once again sentencing Shaver to death. Shaver claimed he was innocent until the time of his execution. He entered the Huntsville State Prison death chamber on the morning of July 25, 1958, on his 33rd birthday, and was pronounced dead at 12:05 a.m. While everyone involved with the tragic case was given the closure they needed to move on, there were many confusing aspects of the crime that were never resolved. There were several contradictory reports of what actually happened in the early morning of July 4th, 1954. Some may be insignificant, but others help paint a very different picture of what actually happened that night. Patrolman Eugene Talbert claimed that he and his partner found Shaver's car parked on the side of the road, and he sent his partner to notify Constable Ed Schaefer. It was then that Talbert claimed Shaver emerged from bushes on a bluff overlooking the pit and began to walk towards his car. He drew his weapon and placed him under arrest. Construction worker Charlie Thial testified at the trial that he was sleeping in his car in the gravel pit and was awakened by officers. He told the court that he saw Shaver walk up to the scene of the crime after police had arrived and asked, "What's going on?" He also testified that he seemed normal and said he spent an hour with him at the county hospital after he was arrested. That raises serious questions about the officer's testimony and why he would be granted access to Shaver after his arrest. However, at the retrial, Thial claimed he saw Shaver running from nearby brush and shouted for help. Patrolman Talbert confirmed he heard Thial's plea for help, and it was then that he arrested Jimmy and placed him in his car. That story makes a lot more sense if you're a prosecution witness trying to prove Shaver was sane at the time of the crime. No sane person is going to simply walk up to the scene and ask, "What's going on?" Thial clearly had some type of relationship with the officers if his testimony about spending time with Shaver at the hospital is true. At the first trial, defense attorney Sam McCollum questioned Constable Ed Schaefer's motives the night of the arrest. "You assumed command of the investigation, did you?" "Yes." "Even though the crime was outside your precinct?" "Yes." "Did you try to get the constable in charge of that precinct?" "No." "Didn't you throw the defendant into the bottom of your car?" "No. It was Deputy Constable Benny West's car." "Did West take Shaver to your office?" "Yes." "Why didn't you send him to jail instead of to your office?" "I had a reason. I wanted Colonel Albert Feldman to talk with this man." Feldman was the San Antonio area provost marshal and had ordered the dispatch of the 100 Lackland military personnel and the deployment of 2 military helicopters to help search for Shaver. Constable Schaefer's testimony raises a couple of questions. Why was he so quick to assume command of an investigation outside of his jurisdiction, and why was his first instinct to send Shaver to meet with Feldman? He claimed he wanted to get Jimmy out of the area as quickly as possible to save him from potential violence from the search mob, but the decision to take him to his office to speak with Feldman instead of securing him at the jail is harder to explain. If he was going to grant Feldman access to him, that could have been done at the jail, and it raises questions as to what military personnel actually met with Shaver and for what reason. The only reason he would suggest that Shaver be taken to meet with Feldman is if he was aware that he was an airman, and the only way he could know that is if he was told about the identification made at the scene by the tavern waitress, Della Sanchez. And remember, not only did she identify him, she reportedly said, "He's the one who did it," which she couldn't possibly have known. She never claimed to see Jimmy abduct Chere Jo. One news report suggests that no identification was made at the scene at all, and that Shaver was driven away before any of the searchers were notified he'd been found. Another report, fit for a Hollywood movie, suggests Shaver was turned over to the angry mob and taken back to the cafe where he was identified by Mrs. Sanchez. It almost seems like reports were being given to create as much confusion as possible. What if the quick decision to deploy extensive military resources and the eagerness to deliver Jimmy to Lackland officials was because someone knew it was Jimmy all along? The Lackland psychiatrists used by Shaver's defense were Gilbert J. Rose, chief of the psychiatric clinic at Lackland Air Force Base, and Louis Jolly West, chief of the psychiatric section at Lackland Hospital. What no one knew at the time was that West was one of the main psychiatrists involved in the CIA's MKULTRA mind control project that officially began on April 3, 1953. West's involvement was recently confirmed by researcher and author Tom O'Neill in his book Chaos. The CIA recruited West after his involvement in the court-martial hearings of 36 American POWs that had confessed to war crimes during and after the war. He testified that their confessions were not genuine and that they were only provided after they were tortured and deprived of sleep for long periods of time. His clinical research focused on the effects of inhumanity, sleep deprivation, the use of drugs to alter the mind, and the psychophysiology of hypnosis and suggestibility. The MKUltra project wasn't exposed until the mid-1970s, when New York Times journalist Seymour Hersh learned of it and published an article exposing it, leading to congressional hearings in 1975 and 1977. The chief of the CIA's chemical division, Sidney Gottlieb, was called to testify.
Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, whom we recently filmed near his California home, oversaw many of the CIA behavioral programs. He retired in 1973 and destroyed the records of this work. In sort of a valedictory letter, Dr. Gottlieb wrote that he and his colleagues had been able to maintain contact with the leading edge of developments in the field of biological and chemical control of human behavior. Dr. Gottlieb also testified before the Senate subcommittee, but from an anteroom where he could not be filmed because of what his lawyer termed health and cardiac problems. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview.
In his book, O'Neill claims West said in a memo to Gottlieb, "It has been found to be feasible to take the memory of a definite event in the life of an individual and through hypnotic suggestion bring about the subsequent conscious recall to the effect that this never actually took place, but that a different fictional event actually did occur." The claims were based on West's 1956 paper titled The Psychophysiological Studies of Hypnosis and Suggestibility. The ultimate goal of the MKUltra program was to create a Manchurian candidate, a sleeper assassin who could be activated upon receiving a key word or phrase while in a post-hypnotic trance and have no knowledge of doing it.
But documents clearly show that the CIA was attempting to develop agents over whom they had as much control as possible. Agents who would perform tasks contrary to their own good.
Normally conditioned American who's been trained to kill and then to have no memory of having killed. His brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry cleaned.
Is a Manchurian candidate, controlled by others to do things against his will, possible?
Shaver's confession to the crime wasn't the first statement he gave that day. When he arrived at San Antonio Police Headquarters on the morning of July 4th, after his meeting with Air Force officials in Constable Schaefer's office, as per the official story, he denied committing the crime. In his first signed statement, he claimed that it was Sumter Cobali, his drinking partner that night, who committed the murder. Shaver claimed he came out of the tavern and found Bali in the front seat of the car and Chere Jo in the back seat, crying for her parents. They drove to the gravel pit, turned off the lights, Bali hit her, and Shaver ran off. He passed a lie detector test after giving that statement. His wife testified that when she went to see him, he didn't recognize her at first, and later told her, "They're trying to pin a murder rap on me that I didn't do." The Lackland psychiatrist testified that Shaver denied having anything to do with the murder during a 4-hour examination. It wasn't until he was put under hypnosis and drugged with sodium amytal that his story changed, and he signed the statement confessing to the murder. His written confession was significantly different than what he allegedly said during the exam, and his counsel argued that he'd been without sleep for many hours. Shaver was hypnotized, drugged, and interrogated for a total of 40 man-hours by West, Rose, and Raymond Brown before the first trial began. On the stand, West testified that during the truth serum interview, Shaver told him he began drinking at 1 p.m. on July 3rd, and that after drinking a pint of whiskey, he heard the voice of God, and he was told to destroy Beth. He continued drinking, picked up Sumter Cobali later in the afternoon, and they went to the Lazy A Tavern. It should be pointed out that Bali testified he was drinking with Shaver from 5 p.m. to 11:30 and said he seemed normal the entire night. Bali had no reason to cover for Shaver after he implicated him in the murder. West then claims that Shaver decided to take Bali back to the base only after noticing Chere Jo and her brother at the bar. According to J.C. Horton, his family arrived at the tavern at 9:30, suggesting Shaver didn't notice the children for at least 2 hours. Then, West explains, Jimmy returned to the tavern and saw Chere Jo throw a rock at his car. That's when the voice returned saying, "This is Beth," and he abducted her. That was the only time Shaver ever claimed, allegedly, that he saw her throw a rock at his car. In his written statement, he said a little girl started talking to him outside, and when she came over to his car, he abducted her. Also, he made no mention of hearing voices, and he never mentioned Beth to anyone, before or after that interview. The Beth character was the foundation for West's theories. West testified that Beth was a childhood playmate who made sexual advances towards Shaver when he was 8 years old. He rejected her, and she hit him on the head with a rock. Seeing Chere Jo throw the rock at his car was supposed to be what triggered his past trauma by making him think she was Beth and kill her as the voices told him to. During the retrial, West, Rose, and Shaver's mother testified that Beth R. was Jimmy's cousin. His mother said that she was 2 years older than him and that she abused him when he was 10, and claimed that she did hit Jimmy in the head with a rock. She also claimed that he suffered from a host of past traumas and debilitating headaches, including on July 3rd. If all that was true, he likely underwent treatment by the Lackland doctors prior to the trial, though there are no existing records of any treatment. West and Gilbert Rose emphasized that a 2-hour bout of insanity caused the crime, but alcohol was what brought his insane rage to a head. They took it a step further by suggesting that the crime probably wouldn't have happened if Shaver hadn't been drinking. That's interesting because during the insanity hearing, West told the jury about Jimmy's long history of abnormalities that he discovered during the hypnotic truth serum exams and named 23 different afflictions, compulsions, and deviant behaviors. Heavy drinking was one of them. West claimed that Shaver suffered from heavy drinking throughout his life. Yet somehow it wasn't until he was 29, on a night that multiple people claimed he wasn't drunk, that alcohol triggered the voices that told him to brutally murder a little girl who reminded him of a girl he knew when he was 10 years old. That's a fantastic tale. He claimed Jimmy had a morbid fear of guns, which is quite odd, considering he was a gunner on a B-24 bomber and had 10 months of combat duty during his 3 years of service. He also suggested that Jimmy suffered from amnesia, which was incredibly self-serving, but it's also a side effect of truth serums like sodium amytal. At the 1977 congressional hearings, MKULTRA documents from 1955 confirmed that researchers were looking for substances that would produce total amnesia and loss of memory in the subjects. The amnesia would encompass not only the actions performed by their alternate personalities, it would also remove any memory of ever being programmed. Shaver maintained his innocence until the time of his death, and went as far as to say he was framed for the crime and was waiting for a man to come forward that could exonerate him. Shaver's lawyer, MC Gonzalez, was able to have the first trial delayed while they attempted to track down a key witness who Shaver claimed saw the whole thing and could exonerate him. He surfaced nearly 4 years later on February 26, 1958, as Jimmy sat on death row. But he told a much different story. James Holder met Shaver in jail in 1955 after he was arrested for drunk driving. He couldn't afford to pay the fine, so he served out his time. He arrived on October 24th and was released on November 22nd. He and Shaver became friends, and eventually Jimmy started talking about his trial. He said that if he was cleared of the charges against him, the Air Force would have to give him back pay, and told Holder that if he would be a witness for him, he'd split his back pay with him. Shaver wanted him to say he was at the bar and saw 2 Latin American men drive off in his car while he was passed out in the back seat. Holder told the district attorney that he wasn't there that night, he didn't see Shaver that night, and he didn't even know where the Lazy A Tavern was. Former inmate Robert Lee Paxton was called to testify as to whether he knew anything regarding the case, but claimed he had no relevant information. Donald Martin Summers told a very different story. He confessed to the killing of Chere Jo Horton and gave a detailed description of the crime. It was ultimately ruled a hoax to buy Shaver more time, and it worked. Jimmy was granted 2 stays of execution while they investigated his story. Jimmy Shaver was a husband and a father who had no criminal record prior to July 1954. He served in World War II and was honorably discharged from the Air Force with a clean service record. The events of that night were clearly set in motion long before July 3rd, and at least one of the men called on to defend him time and time again was involved. In 1954, the MKULTRA program was just getting started, and Jimmy Shaver and Chere Jo Horton were two of its earliest casualties. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next time for more cults, crimes, and conspiracies.